Welcome, everybody. My name is Otto Siebum. I'm the Hans Rausing Professor for History of Science at Uppsala University. The principal, Björn Wittrock, is unfortunately not able to come today, but he sends his warm regards. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Joel Isaac, and who is currently here a Pro Futura Fellow. So Joel Isaac was trained as a historian at Royal Holloway at the University of London and at Trinity College in Cambridge. From 2007 to 2011, he held a lectureship at Queen Mary, University of London as well, and from where he then moved on to Cambridge University, where he's now a senior lecturer in the history of modern political thought. So, Joel Isaac's research focuses on the history of social and political thought in the United States and Great Britain. His earliest research examined how theories of knowledge drove important changes in the human sciences during the 20th century. So much of his work in this area is presented in his first book, Working Knowledge, Making the Human Sciences from Parsons to Kuhn, which was published in 2012 with Harvard University Press, and which also was awarded the Gladstone Prize by the Royal Historical Society. In Working Knowledge, he explores how influential thinkers in the 20th century middle decades understood the relation among science, knowledge, and the empirical study of human affairs. For a number of these thinkers, questions about what kinds of knowledge the human sciences could produce did not rest on grand ideological gestures towards science and objectivity, but were linked to the ways in which knowledge was created and taught in laboratories and seminar rooms. So Joel Isaac places special emphasis on the practical, local manifestations of their complex theoretical ideas. In the case of Percy William Bridgman, Talcott Parsons, Skinner, Quine, and Thomas Kuhn, the institutional milieu in which these people worked and constructed their models was the Harvard University. So Joel Isaac delineates the role that the Harvard complex played in fostering connections between epistemological discourses and the practices of science. Now, being a fellow at Scas, Joel Isaac will be writing a book on the revival of 18th century categories of political and moral thought in the 20th century. Its principal thesis is that the writing of a cohort of influential philosophers, economists, and political theorists who published in the interwar and post-Second World War decades, we can see an attempt to rethink Enlightenment notions of sociability, practical reasoning, property, and the state. Crucially, this process of reappraisal was refracted through more modern idioms: neoclassical economics, analytical philosophy, decision theory, and empirical political science. The ideas that resulted from this encounter of Enlightenment concepts and modern idioms provided the foundations of modern liberal and neoliberal thought. So the working title of this project hence is called the Cold War Enlightenment. Today, Joel Isaac will lead us into the research project by means of presenting, I would probably guess, a case study, which he called Clifford Geertz' World. So since Geertz' anthropology, which we all know, lacks a comprehensive reconstruction, Joel argues, he reworked Geertz's published and unpublished material in order to offer a more integrated account on Geertz's social thought. So Joel, welcome to Uppsala again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to Professor Siebum for introducing me and particularly for stepping in at short notice for Bjorn. Before I get started, just a kind of word of warning, perhaps. As Professor Siebum has already sort of suggested, in my talk this evening, I'm not giving a kind of general overview of my research project, the Cold War Enlightenment, but instead I'm offering a more kind of focus study, a case study, which I hope will sort of honour the lecture format to some degree. But I should say, if there is any polish in what you're about to hear, it's nonetheless the case that what you'll hear is very much a kind of work in progress. And so I'm particularly sort of eager to get your input on what I hope is a at least partially persuasive rereading of a very important figure in 20th century Anglophone social thought. One thing I've learned from talking a little bit about Geertz over recent months is that he tends to elicit strong opinions, so I look forward to hearing some of yours. The story begins with a robbery. Around the time of the First World War, Cohen, a Jewish trader, was selling his wares to a Berber tribe at Marmusha in the northeastern Middle Atlas. Since the late 19th century, when the caravan economy between Fez and sub-Saharan Africa began to spawn fixed regional markets in Morocco, Jewish merchants had regularly established temporary trading posts among the Berber tribes in the mountains. Commerce of this kind was made possible by the Mezrag, the trade pact whose purpose was to protect the peddlers as they moved out from their base in the towns into the tribal hinterlands. On the night in question, some members of a neighbouring tribe, which was in rebellion against French colonial forces, broke into Cohen's residence to steal his supplies. In the melee that ensued, 2 of Cohen's associates were killed and his goods seized. Afterward, Cohen sought to collect the indemnity owed him, his ar as it was called, under the terms of the Mezrag he had pledged with the Marmouchan chief. The Mezrag had in fact been outlawed by the French protectorate, which had been established in Morocco some years earlier. When Cohen went to the local French garrison, he was told that they could have no part in his attempts to redeem his losses. Undeterred, Cohen rode into the stronghold of the rebellious tribe with Marmouchan tribesmen and promptly staged a raid of his tormentors' sheep. Fighters from the hostile tribe quickly arrived on the scene, but seeing immediately who was there and why, agreed to provide Cohen with his ar, in this case 500 sheep. Cohen took the flock back to Marmusha, only to have it confiscated by French legionnaires. Cohen himself was briefly imprisoned by French authorities and upon release pleaded, without success, for the return of his sheep. Anyone who has read Clifford Geertz's famous essay, Thick Description Toward an Interpretive Theory of Culture, will have encountered this story. Reproduced from Geertz's field notes, this somewhat farcical tale of a robbery gone bad in the Middle Atlas was Geertz's gloss on a philosophical distinction. In a series of essays, the Oxford philosopher Gilbert Ryle had drawn a contrast between how we understand involuntary and voluntary actions. Take the distinction between eye twitches on the one hand and winks on the other. Behaviourally, these 2 events are identical. They consist in the contraction of the eyelids. Yet, Ryle noted, there is all the difference in the world between them. The involuntary twitch can be explained in naturalistic terms. But if we think a person contracted their eyelids in order to communicate something, then we are drawn inexorably into normative vocabulary, a language of intentions and socially established codes. Maybe the winker is attempting to initiate another into a conspiracy, or making a parody of such a conspiratorial wink, and so on and so forth. So, to know what a winker means by winking, we have to know things about their intentions, about the situation in which they act, and about the signalling conventions within the culture. For example, in order to wink conspiratorially, one has to do, as Geertz reported, no less than 5 things. One had to wink first deliberately, secondly to someone in particular, thirdly to impart a special message, fourth according to a socially established code, and fifth and finally without the cognizance of the rest of the company. Reconstructing what such a wink is communicating is therefore an exercise in social analysis. Like Ryle's winks, the mock sheep raid staged by the Marmouchan tribesmen was for Geertz a symbolic act. It was a commentary on the earlier actions of members of the rebellious tribe and an invocation, backed by force, of the rules governing the Mezrag. The confiscation of the sheep and the imprisonment of Cohen were also symbolic acts. The French were communicating to Cohen and the Berbers that native trading customs would have no place in the protectorate, that French imperial power was now the preponderant force in the land. not all sheep raids and not all eye twitches are born equal. Thick description, cultural systems, webs of meaning. Most of us have learned the slogans that define Geertz's social thought. In the scholarly imagination, Geertz's place is by now pretty well fixed. Social inquiry, Geertz tells us, searches for explications, not laws. As good Geertzians, we must analyse social actions in terms of the meanings attached to them by the agents who perform them. Once we get beyond these methodological bromides, however, the commentary on Geertz breaks down into local disputes. Most notably, many anthropologists, Victor Crapanzano perhaps first and foremost, have doubts about the epistemic basis of Geertz's thick descriptions. In what, they ask, does knowing what another person means by what they say or do actually consist? How exactly does Geertz know that when the Balinese cry out in support of their chosen rooster in a cockfight, they are probing, as Geertz says they are, the deepest aspects of their subjectivity as Balinese? Many of Geertz's ethnographic findings have also been called into question, from his infamous involution thesis about Indonesian agriculture, I'll come to that a bit later, to his treatment of the Priyayi variant of Javanese religion. In recent years, the limits of Geertz's anthropology have been the subject of much discussion. His unduly reified and synchronic view of culture, his blindness to concrete questions of imperial power and capitalist hegemony, his early commitment to modernization theory in the style of Talcott Parsons, and his failure in later life to find an effective substitute for the Parsonian schema. In my lecture this evening, I want to convince you that there is something more interesting in Geertz's thought than these standard readings would suggest. My purpose is not to champion or defend Geertz, but to argue that his anthropology contains untapped resources for social theory. In particular, I see Geertz as presenting a major challenge to theorists and historians of capitalism. Geertz tried to splice a semiotic conception of culture into an account of capitalist or commercial development. Any account of modern political economy worth its salt, I think, ought to go through Geertz, who represents what has been for a generation the leading voice in the human sciences, or a leading voice at least. And that at least is the case I want to make tonight. In my discussion, I'm going to proceed from the familiar to the relatively unfamiliar. So I'm going to start with Geertz's famous conception of culture, and then in the sequel, I'll talk about Geertz's approach to political economy, which is, I think, less well understood. Okay. So, the theory of culture. The most familiar claim about Geertz's theory of culture, which I've kind of already touched on, is that it treats cultural analysis as a fundamentally interpretive enterprise. Students of culture must seek not causal explanations, but an understanding of social processes. An understanding of social behaviour requires the analyst to examine it from the point of view of the actors themselves. The analyst must elucidate the meanings agents attach to their actions on the assumption that this interpretive approach will account for why they behave as they do. Only by taking this interpretive approach could one, as Geertz put it, construe social expressions on their surface enigmatical, bat sheep raid or the wink. So that's one key feature of the theory of culture, but I want to try and kind of build on that, if only briefly, just to kind of fix our ideas about Geertz's vision of cultural analysis. All right, so far perhaps so obvious. Behind these Geertzian remarks, though, was a philosophical anthropology that treated symbols not as mere representations or mirrors of the external world, but as the phraseology went, vehicles of thought. When Geertz first encountered symbolic theory as an undergraduate at Antioch College in Ohio in the late 1940s, it was usual to draw out the singular nature of the symbol by comparing it with the behavioral response to signs. Typically, the sign was understood as the stimulus for a conditioned reflex, the ring of the bell that triggered a hunger response. That same ring became a symbol only when, for example, bells were tolled with the intention of honouring the memory of some controversial figure or event. In that case, it would matter to those who heard the pealing of the bells, who ordered the ringing of those bells, and to what end. What made this ringing a symbolic action, then, as opposed to a sign or signal or kind of trigger, was the fact that it was about something. It denoted an object in the world, which was thus beheld, argued over, affirmed, avoided, or whatever, but beheld in common. A dog may learn, on hearing the name of its owner, to look for them. It responds, using this distinction I've been making, to a sign or a signal. But if a person were to enter a crowded room and say the owner's name, James, the response would likely be to treat the utterance as a symbolic action. Someone might reply, for example, "What about James?" As Susanne Langer put it, symbols were vehicles for the conception of objects. They allowed one to make assertions about states of affairs. Furthermore, to be grasped as assertions about a world held in common, these symbols had to be public. That is, they had to be intersubjectively understood and present for inspection. So that's a second feature of Geertz's cultural theory, this theory of the symbol, which I think is crucial. Now to a third point. Geertz's treatment of human beings as symbol-mongering animals was part of a much larger wave of symbolic theory that crested in the 1950s and 1960s. A concern for symbolism and its role in making human consciousness distinctive united several disciplines during this period, including linguistics, symbolic logic, phenomenology, cognitive psychology, literary criticism, poetry, and the social sciences. The theory of symbolism on which Geertz drew thus had roots in the thought of Husserl, Cassirer, Marcel, Carnap, and Peirce. It crystallized in the works of authors like Susanne Langer, Kenneth Burke, and Walker Percy, as well as in the writings of the new critics like I.A. Richards and William Empson. Now that's quite the list, but this is a much tighter network of ideas than this eclectic list of names suggests. Indeed, and I mean this is actually a pretty major unwritten episode in 20th century intellectual history, this concern for symbolism spawned a series of therapeutic or reformist movements within the popular culture, from C.K. Ogden's Programme for Basic English to the general semantics of Count Alfred Koszybski. So it was then that in a 1964 essay on the theory of ideology, Geertz bemoaned the fact that, and I quote him here, the general mainstream of social scientific theory had been virtually untouched by one of the most important trends in recent thought, the effort, and I'm continuing the quotation of Geertz here, to construct an independent science of what Kenneth Burke has called symbolic action. He continued, neither the work of such figures as Peirce, Wittgenstein, Cassirer, Langer, Ryle, or Morris, nor of such literary critics as Coleridge, Eliot, Burke, Empson, Blackmore, Brooks, or Auerbach seem to have had any appreciable impact on the general pattern of social scientific analysis. Geertz's aim, as he asserted elsewhere, was to see that the news about this independent science of symbolic action reaches anthropology. That's a statement he makes up front in the essay called Thick Description. Now, in Geertz's hands, this news about the independent science of symbolic action was put to immediate use. It provided the basis, indeed, for Geertz's signature theory of culture, which he began to discuss in a systematic way in the 1960s. Culture, Geertz maintained, was nothing more or nothing less than an assemblage of symbolic systems. He argued that the virtue of such systems, from an evolutionary point of view, was that they made Homo sapiens a uniquely adaptable organism, whereas for the lower beasts, genes largely programmed behavior, humans had evolved a way of placing a good deal of their means of cognition and of moral judgment and the regulation of the emotions outside of their skins. According to Geertz, that was what made the symbol systems of religion, ideology, or common sense. That's what these systems were for. And these systems were all the more flexible for being extrinsic and symbolic. Lodged as they were in cultural codes, rhetorical tropes like metaphor, allegory, analogy, and ambiguity could radically and swiftly transform symbolic systems in the face of new circumstances. On this basis, according to Geertz, anthropology could be, on the one hand, resolutely naturalistic and scientific, because symbolic systems were a feature of human evolution, and they could be studied as objectively as any other features of the natural world. Geertz was uncompromising about the objectivity of this kind of analysis, of interpretivism. On the other hand, anthropology could also avail itself of the critical apparatus of poetics or of criticism, because tropes operated across the entire terrain of symbolic action, from the rhyme of the ancient mariner to the obstreperousness of French legionnaires in the Middle Atlas around 1914. Okay, so to round out this account of Geertz's cultural theory, it's worth noting a final feature of that theory, besides its deep immersion in mid-20th century poetics and the theory of symbolism. The object of ethnography, on Geertz's view, and I think this is often misunderstood about Geertz, the object of ethnography was not the construction of models of symbolic systems, as if cultures were fully integrated and coherent systems that directed the actions of those who lived within them. The aim of anthropology for Geertz was rather to reconstruct a discourse, to determine what, in a concrete sequence of symbolic action, was being said. And I'm quoting Geertz here, "The thing to ask about a burlesqued wink or a mock sheep raid is not what their ontological status is. Rather, the thing to ask is what their import is, what it is, ridicule or challenge, irony or anger, snobbery or pride, that, in their occurrence and through their agency, is getting said." Accordingly, and here Geertz drew on Paul Ricoeur's theory of interpretation, for Geertz, the purpose of ethnography was to write down or inscribe an arc of social discourse. That's what the ethnographer for Geertz does. They write down what is said in a sequence of symbolic actions. That was just what Geertz had done with the story of Cohen and the robbery. The sequence of events related in that story became a discourse that the ethnographer had to interpret. It was a literal text that they had to read. All right. So there is a brief and, of course, in many respects, somewhat crude overview of what strike me as the key features of Geertz's cultural theory. It is a vision of culture as symbolic, and of the symbolic as the means by which human beings become attuned to and think about their world. Finally, it is a study of symbolic action not as a system, but as a discourse. It is a study of the ways a culture says something of something, sometimes in a very focused and imaginative way, as in King Lear or the Balinese cockfight, and sometimes in looser, more discontinuous ways, like the confusion of tongues in which Cohen was involved. Now, this vision of the world is often thought not to touch some of the more historical and economic aspects of Geertz's thought. Those who read him as a cultural theorist typically have very little to say about his concrete claims in his work on Indonesian economic development or commercial life in the Moroccan town of Safrou. On the contrary, I see one of the key struggles of Geertz's entire career to consist in the attempt to bring his vision of ethnography as the interpretation of discourse into his analysis of the disjointed nature of capitalist development in the post-colonial nations. Commercial life in the global south was as talkative as cockfights or religious feasts. Now, professional economists, for Geertz, by and large, did not listen to this chatter because they thought economic institutions only ever involved one kind of conversation, namely the utility maximizing of Homo economicus. And so part of Geertz's life's work was to try to show that economic growth, which he assumed all countries would want, could be achieved only if one grasped the symbolic dimension of markets and trade in the new nations. One could learn a great deal from what was said by post-colonial economic activities, Geertz was telling us, from exchange in the bazaar to work spreading in Javanese wet rice agriculture. In my remaining time this evening, I will describe how Geertz tried to bring these cultural and economic studies together. And as I see it, and here I'm kind of giving you the structure of the rest of the lecture, Geertz executed a double movement. First, latching onto a particular analysis of economic institutions in the post-colonial states, then bringing his cultural theory into that analysis. I shall therefore commence the remainder of my lecture with an account of how Geertz, early in his career, zeroed in on what one may characterize as the functional dysfunction of commercial life in post-colonial states. Next, I examine Geertz's attempt in his work on Morocco in the 1970s to encourage what he called a linguistic turn in economics. In this endeavor, as we shall see, Geertz was buoyed somewhat by the attempt to transcend the general equilibrium economics that had been dominant in Anglophone economics since the 1940s. As a graduate student in anthropology at Harvard University, Geertz formed a lifelong research interest in the market structures of peasant societies, so-called peasant societies. In 1955, Geertz and his wife Hildred undertook their first fieldwork as PhD students in Java as part of a project co-sponsored by the Center for International Studies, or CENIS, at MIT, and researchers at Gadjah Mada, the first state university established by the Republic of Indonesia. CENIS, the Center for International Studies at MIT, was a research unit dedicated to policy planning and intelligence gathering in the new nations, and it soon established two teams to work on Indonesia, a group of economists with a brief to develop position papers on economic stabilization and growth policy, and a team of ethnographers to collect data on the ground that could give the economists something of the local flavor. Between 1952 and 1954, Geertz spent 2.5 years in rural central Java, and much of that time conducting fieldwork in a subsidiary market town, Pare. He returned to Harvard to complete his doctorate before accepting a full-time role as a consultant with the economist group at CENIS, and it was under the auspices of the center that he returned to Indonesia in 1957-58 and spent a year at a new field site in Bali. The texts that emerge from this fieldwork, which is to say basically the entire stream of Geertz's publications, more or less up to the mid-1960s, form an interconnected whole. 3 strands of analysis are visible, each of which involve the attempt to assess Indonesia as what Geertz called a post-traditional no man's land. The first strand of Geertz's work addressed the problem of cultural dislocation. This was treated in Geertz's early essays in terms of the fate of religious sensibilities in the face of haphazard urbanization and a new mass politics. Geertz suggested that in the limbo of post-traditional Javanese society, cultural codes previously absorbed into everyday experience were becoming abstract and loaded with political meaning, a process he termed ideologization. There's much more that I could say about that, but for now I just want to have that strand in mind as I proceed. Geertz finished his PhD thesis in 1956 and took up his consultant position at CENIS, where he started to engage with the then lively anthropological literature on cultural ecology. In 1956, Geertz taught a class on cultural ecology at Harvard, while also writing some of his ideas about this new approach into a report for the CENIS Indonesia project. That report was eventually published in revised form as Agricultural Involution in 1963. In that book, Geertz began by acknowledging that the population problem in Indonesia was the central one facing Indonesian policymakers, and concentrated his energies on accounting for the preponderance of impoverished rural villages in Java, which is where the bulk of Indonesia's rapidly expanding population was based. Now, Geertz's explanation for this imbalance of population and also for its expansion under near starvation conditions in agriculture, Geertz's explanation for this was at once political and ecological. First, it was simply a central feature of the sour or wet rice agriculture that it could support intensive cultivation without the marginal yield falling rapidly enough to discourage further population growth. In contrast, the slash-and-burn cultivation techniques of the tropical forests on the outer islands in Indonesia could not have supported such an intensification of farming techniques. Second, the overdriving of the Sawa regime in Java was the direct result of Dutch mercantilism, especially in the 19th century. Dutch colonial policy was, as Geertz neatly put it, to bring Indonesia's crops into the modern world, but not her people. Dutch policy blocked the Javanese from benefiting fully from the export trade and left Java stuck with a dualistic economy in which a capital-intensive export centre existed cheek by jowl with a labour-intensive but capital-poor subsistence agriculture. A Gothic involution of wet rice agriculture, an ever greater intensification of that kind of agriculture, and its ability to support an ever-growing population at falling marginal yields was the result. This was what Geertz called agricultural involution. These reflections on the jumbling of politics and the involution of agricultural production set the frame for Geertz's encounter with market institutions in Java. The third, and I think most important focal point of Geertz's work in the 1950s and 1960s addressed the dilemmas of social change and economic development from a local institutional perspective. And this is the third point on the slide. What did the problems of shared poverty and involution look like at the level of the village community, Geertz asked. In the same Annus Mirabilis of 1956, when Geertz had given lectures on cultural ecology and written the report that became Agricultural Involution, he also gave a course on economic anthropology at Harvard and prepared for Senis a local study of economic change in Pare, which was published in 1965 as The Social History of an Indonesian Town. In the Senis case study, Geertz showed how the general forces of economic dualism had buffeted Pare in particular. And what Geertz found in Pare was an extensive and dynamic market economy at the centre of the town's social life. But crucially for Geertz, it was of the form known as the bazaar, that Persian word of uncertain origin. The bazaar economy entailed forms of economic relationship that, for the time being, seemed to preclude firm-type organisation of the sort that powered economic growth in the West. There were, Geertz noted, signs that Santri Muslim traders in Pare might find the entrepreneurial role congenial, like Weber's Calvinists. But the bazaar economy encouraged a small trader mentality that was, as Weber had already stated, pre-capitalist in character. Now, Geertz was emphatic that this mentality was not in any sense a cultural failing, but was in fact the product of the social order in which the bazaar was embedded. Quote, "Whatever is obstructing the development of a modern economy out of the general background of the bazaar economy, it is not the lack of a business-like orientation on the part of the bazaar traders. What it lacked when contrasted with the Western firm-based economy was appropriate organisational forms. And this in turn rendered the Pare Bazaar a theatre of great drama, yet also chronic insecurity and conservatism. Competitive energies were spent in haggling between buyer and seller, rather than in rivalry between sellers, because of a chronic lack of information about the quality of particular goods and their going rate. This was in part the product of the absence of systematic accounting. Equally, in such an individualized market, capital did not flow wherever profitability was highest, but was instead used to shore up links between larger and smaller traders. Merchants preferred to use credit as a form of insurance rather than as an instrument to maximize profits. Against this backdrop of uncertainty about prices and customary restraints on access to credit, traders tended to make small deals rather than invest their time and capital in securing larger exchanges of goods. All of these features of the bazaar economy that Geertz found in Pare were then, on his reading, locked in place by continual population pressure and by the ongoing involution of agriculture in Java. Now, it followed from Geertz's cultural analysis of the bazaar that sheer access to capital in the form of foreign aid was unlikely to deliver growth, despite what development theorists like Walt Rostow, in his Stages of Economic Growth, suggested. Insofar as insurance norms governed exchange, aid in the form of capital or technology was likely to exacerbate rather than solve the problem of low productivity in the Indonesian economy. Moreover, the cultural norms and economic institutions that define the bazaar were not at all, for Geertz, instances of economic primitivism or, to use a more modern idiom, predictable irrationality. Rather, the cultural forms of the bazaar were, for Geertz, rational innovations developed in response to the effects of colonization and the external shocks delivered by the forces of global trade. This made the cultural understanding of economic development especially critical for Geertz. Now, before I move in the kind of last part of the lecture to taking up the culminating phase of Geertz's political economy, I think it will be useful to sketch out the wider background of economic thinking within which Geertz developed his own approach. As it were, the terrain of economic thinking or political economy as it appeared to Geertz, as he began to think through the problem of the bazaar and the challenges of economic growth in the 1960s and 1970s. First and foremost, the German social theorist Max Weber was crucial to Geertz's efforts to create what we might call, if a little awkwardly, a cultural political economy. The reason for this was that it was Weber who insisted that economics had to be a sociological and historical discipline rather than a purely theoretical one. During his academic career, Weber held chairs in the economic sciences and thought of his work as continuous with the new economics that had emerged during the marginal revolution in the later 19th century. For Weber, as for many of his contemporaries, the new marginal theory of value, as expounded by members of the Austrian school such as Karl Menger and Friedrich von Wieser, was the cutting edge of economic theory. Weber wanted what he called social economics to provide an umbrella under which the new economics of Menger, Walras, and Alfred Marshall could be deployed most effectively. With the help of the analytical machinery of the new economics, Sozialökonomik, as Weber called it, would come into its own as the discipline that analysed the social foundations of modern capitalism, the world of financial and stock markets, trade bargaining, vertically integrated multi-divisional firms, and so on. The provision of such a historical science of capitalism was the aim of Weber's multi-volume editorial project, left incomplete at the time of his death in 1920, the Grundriss der Sozialökonomik, the outline of social economics. Now, in the medium term, Weber's social economics ran into the sand. This outcome can in part be ascribed to his premature death. More importantly, however, general equilibrium economics, in the vein of Walras and Pareto, was becoming increasingly popular among a rising generation of professional economists in Britain and the United States. This is all, of course, to historians of economics, a very familiar story. So too the new field of Keynesian macroeconomics. The practitioners of these highly formalized and mathematical forms of economics now drew lines of exclusion within modern economics, within post-1890s economics. Figures such as Arthur Cecil Pigou came to be considered part of the quote-unquote classical tradition, even though they were fully engaged with the new marginal economics. By the 1930s, the very notion of utility itself, so crucial to the marginal tradition, was purged from professional economics as a metaphysical hangover from an earlier era. Moreover, in the 1940s, works such as John Hicks's Value and Capital and Paul Samuelson's textbook, simply entitled Economics, offered new mathematical syntheses of neoclassical equilibrium theory and Keynesian macroeconomics. And so in America, Weber was read out of the history of modern economics altogether and absorbed into sociology. You can kind of trace that shift almost exactly. There was a wave of translations in the late 1940s of Weber by American sociologists trying to appropriate him as one of their champions. At that point onward, he becomes Weber the sociologist and is no longer Weber the economist. Now, however, the problem of an independent theory of capitalism as a social system did not go away. The problem Weber wished urgently to understand was capitalism's self-undermining character, its driving of instrumental rationality to the point of mass irrationality. In Weber's analysis, capitalism was fueled by the forces of societal rationalization, the planful calculation of investment and profit by means of money, the rationalized system of law and administration, the perpetuation of an ethic of the calling in labor and entrepreneurship. Yet, over time in Weber's story, capitalism escaped its moral and institutional foundations and confronted those who lived within the system as a force for the disintegration of all social bonds, as a motor of collective alienation. Weber's problem of capitalism drew answers from several quarters during the 20th century, especially in German-speaking Europe. And here we can point, by way of illustration, to the Frankfurt School's attempted redemption of reason from its debasement in the form of instrumental rationality. Another example would be the Freiburg circle of ordo-liberals around Walter Eucken, who argued for a policy of society in which the worst aspects of unrestrained industrial capitalism could be contained by the creation of an economy rooted in small-scale, community-based enterprise. A third example is that of Josef Schumpeter, who foresaw the inevitable socialization of the industrial economy and its management by means of the competition of political elites for a democratic mandate. Now, I mentioned this point about the problem of capitalism and the role of political economy in understanding it for the following reason. The neoclassical growth models on which Geertz was reared offer their own response to this problem of capitalism. In the American liberal vision of industrial capitalism, there could be such a thing as a stable, socially tamed capitalism. Here was a vision of balanced growth that rested on a kind of macroeconomic statecraft. Workable capitalism could be had by pulling the right macroeconomic levers, readjusting the capital-labor ratio through foreign aid, for example, or introducing labor-saving technologies, especially in agriculture. And if you look at American development policy in the global south after the Second World War, it's filled with these kinds of ideas. The prominence of this liberal model, in fact, indicated a key shift in the center of gravity about debates regarding the problem of capitalism in the middle of the 20th century. In the age of decolonization, these debates had gone global. By the 1950s, indeed, neoclassical and Marxist analyses of capitalism and its problems converged on the so-called peasant societies of the global south. This was a clash that was registered on a theoretical level, first of all in the formalism-substantivism debate in history and anthropology, and it soon found a sequel in the contrast between moral economy and political economy approaches to peasant politics. Geertz had already embarked on his ethnography of the Javanese bazaar economy when these disputes exploded onto the scene. And what is interesting for my purposes in this lecture, and this is what I'm going to kind of think about by way of conclusion, is how in the 1970s Geertz tried to kind of steer a course between these different approaches to the problem of capitalism and growth. The arguments underpinning the substantivist and the moral economy viewpoints on peasant societies drew on many sources, but two in particular stand out, and I'm just going to mention them here. One is the work of Karl Polanyi, whose The Great Transformation was frequently cited in the moral economy literature as a seminal text. Now, Polanyi, of course, had his own way of framing the irrational rationality of capitalism, and that was, of course, the dialectic of disembedding and the re-embedding of markets. The second strand of the moral economy literature drew on notions of pre-modern communal restraints on private property and markets. Of course, Karl Marx had ended his career transfixed with the supposed durability of the German mark and similar village communes in Russia. Later Marxist writers such as Eric Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson followed Marx's lead and noted the wide range of historical instances in which the moral rights of a community of workers had resisted the incursion of markets. Thompson famously examined the case of the police of the grain trade, and the long-standing early modern recognition that in times of dearth, the English crowd could demand the truncation of rights of private property in subsistence goods, like grain. In the 1960s, anthropologists such as Eric Wolfe and James Scott explained the resistance among peasants to the imposition of markets in quite similar terms, and they cited Thompson, Hobsbawm, the later Marx, exactly in that vein. Used to living on the subsistence line, the rural poor had strong reasons to fight against the application of the principles of liberal political economy in the form of neoclassical growth strategies. Now, such arguments in the moral economy literature left the door open for a defense of economic formalism, and this is what became the political economy view of peasant politics. This approach was buoyed by public choice theories of the same period, which portrayed many seemingly dissolute social phenomena, voter apathy, free riding, unstable majorities, chronic political instability, as rational adaptations to rewards cost structures facing individual decision makers. Samuel Popkin's The Rational Peasant was perhaps the most famous attempt to apply these methods to peasant nations. Vietnamese peasants, on Popkin's view, were not operating on the principles of Thomsonian moral economy as holdouts to modern capitalism. They were, in fact, themselves entrepreneurial, albeit in ways that did not automatically yield national economic growth. But the potential for economic transformation on the Western model was there, as Popkin saw it. So Geertz. Geertz's response to these alternative ways of thinking about markets and modernization in the 1960s was, in a nutshell, a plague on both your houses. While he was as eager as Polanyi to include the substantive, culturally embedded forms of reasoning in his account of economic organization in the post-colonial states, his assessment of Indonesia's involution and its bizarre economy foreclosed on any easy embrace of Polanyi's double movement or his relentless particularization of economic forms. On the other hand, however, the economism of the neoclassical and the public choice economists was for Geertz altogether too reductive. In his ethnographic study of the Moroccan souk, published at the very end of the 1970s, Geertz asserted that the debate between formalists and substantivists, quote, has now rather staled for all but the most persevering. This was especially true, he argued, for studies of the bazaar, which had been seen either, quote, as the nearest real-world institution to the purely competitive market of neoclassical economics, so-called penny capitalism, to use Saltax's term, or, Geertz wrote, it is regarded as an institution so embedded in its socio-cultural context as to escape the reach of modern economic analysis altogether. That was Polanyi. Now was the time, Geertz argued, for a new synthesis to be forged between economics and anthropology, which would not reduce one to the theoretical scheme of the other. This was, I think, the synthesis that Geertz had been searching for since the mid-1950s, when he first began to explore the peculiarities of the bazaar economy in rural Java. Moreover, this was a middle way in which economic science was not reducible to pure neoclassicism, nor to a purely sociological scheme, that had also been part of Weber's intent in marking out the field of sozial-ökonomik. Weber's project, as I have noted, had been blocked by a strikingly monolithic view of markets, the Walrasian one of perfectly rational and perfectly informed consumers buying and selling according to prices alone in a market that was costless to run. By the late 1960s, however, the Walrasian model began to come under pressure. The actual forces making for exchange and resource allocation in society had been buried beneath the highly idealized assumptions of the neoclassical theory of pure competition. Yet, economists themselves, or at least some of them, began bringing these real-world forces back into the picture, and in the process began to make the institutional, the cultural setting of exchange a crucial feature of economic theory. A lot of these ideas were first formed within the literature on property rights and transaction costs that flowed from the work of the British economist Ronald Coase. But the greatest impetus for these changes came from the emerging economics of information. Once admitted into economic theory, the patently obvious fact that information was neither always free nor always complete to market agents. Once that admission was made, then a whole range of economic forms of organization could be explained as adaptations to the presence or absence of information. Neoclassical economic principles of substitution at the margin and utility maximization were, of course, still relevant in this scheme, but now they had to be seen as part of a large system of social institutions that included values, customs, and traditions, as well as constitutions, governmental arrangements, and the structure of enterprise. So that's a third feature of Geertz's account of the Suk, which I'll fill out in more detail in a moment, the economics of information. I think it's a crucial feature, in fact. The economics of information place the marginal analysis in direct contact with the sociological study of local customs, beliefs, and traditions. On this basis, economic models of information costs and their effects on exchange could be treated as ideal types from which local analyses of markets could be extracted or elaborated upon. And certainly, I think this is how Geertz saw it. His own work on the search for information in the Suk was meant to be the anthropologist's contribution to the economics of information. This was the basis for a new combination of anthropology and economics. By way of just a couple of very brief concluding remarks, I want to explain more carefully why and how Geertz made common cause with information economics. And this is very much kind of, as it were, about as far as I've got with thinking through what Geertz is doing here, but it's where I'm trying to bring together most explicitly the cultural theory and the political economy. To begin with, we need to remind ourselves of how Geertz viewed the typical problems of the bazaar-based economy. The central puzzle for Geertz was the absence in the Pare Bazaar of firm-type organization, with all of the market institutions that the existence of the firm entailed in industrial economies, advertising, brand names, and product standardization. There was no shortage among the peddlers of the bazaar of the acquisitive drive. Geertz had shown that. The desire for profit was absolutely there. Yet it was channeled into Byzantine rituals of bargaining between buyer and seller. Moreover, large deals were scorned in favor of the fractionalization of trades, and credit, again as I've said, flowed not into areas of highest profit, but across a system of clientelization among smaller and larger traders. The failure of conventional neoclassical models of competitive markets to account for these features of the bazaar had led Geertz towards a cultural theory of commercial life, in which the symbolic importance of exchange and of loans outweighed those of the pure rationality of Homo economicus. But as of the mid-1960s, when Geertz published his work on commercial life in Indonesia, he had yet to offer an account of these features of market institutions directly in the terms of his cultural theory, that theory with which we began. The emergence at the turn of the 1970s of the economics of information changed all of this. It alerted Geertz to what he came to see as the defining feature of the bazaar economy, whether in Pare, Indonesia, or Sefru, Morocco, or across large swathes of the global south, or the new nations as he called them. And that feature was the scarcity, the poor quality, and the maldistribution of information. The economists had become interested in information as a means of explaining market failure. One major source of the failure of the price system to allocate resources with maximum efficiency was the fact of uncertainty. Those engaged in market exchange had to make contracts that would hold in future states of the world that were unknown to those who were contracting. Given that it would be impossible to write contracts of exchange that would cover every conceivable future state of the world, markets were constitutively unable to allocate risk with perfect efficiency. This is what got the economists started on the problem. Moreover, although real-world markets did contain mechanisms for allocating risk, like insurance markets, cost-plus contracts, and stock markets, these methods were only as effective as the information on which transactions within those markets were made. And in the typical case, that information was poor and maldistributed. The efficiency of markets, then, depended in part on the quality of information flows within them, the ability of market actors to signal to one another and to coordinate exchange. As it turned out, there were many market scenarios in which that information flow was bound to be poor. In labour markets, as the economist Michael Spence showed, or in second-hand car markets, as George Akerlof explained. In the labour market, for example, individuals tended to enter the market infrequently, and as such, it made little sense for them to invest resources in signalling their worth as potential employees. Poor information flows led to market inefficiencies. I think it's not hard to see why Geertz responded to these kinds of arguments. He found in them a way of describing the productivity limits set by the bazaar economy. But he by no means, and I want to be explicit about this, he by no means wished simply to ape the economists. On the contrary, he insisted that once questions of information and signalling were brought onto the agenda, as they were with a vengeance in the early 1970s in Anglophone economics, then the analysis of symbolic action aimed at communicating within the market was absolutely indispensable. He put it this way in his book-length study of the bazaar economy in Safrou, Morocco. The need is for, one, a qualitative formulation of the information situation in the souk, as the Moroccans themselves conceive of it, the interpretive theory of social action, followed by, two, an analysis of the relation of that situation thus conceived to the process of exchange as it actually takes place. In other words, what was taken as information, as a signal, in the Safrou marketplace depended on the broader discourse of the souk, the sequence of symbolic actions by which information on goods and prices was communicated. And in the souk, according to Geertz, this information was channeled through talk, above all. Quote, "Not only is what goes on in the souk mainly talk," he wrote, "but the meta-talk in which the exchange process moves. In the souk, the flow of words and the flow of values are not two things. They are two aspects of the same thing. As such," Geertz contended, "the linguistic turn that has transformed so great a part of modern social thought has to be made also in economics." And there followed in Geertz's study of the souk a forensic analysis of the information situation in which those seeking trades in the bazaar went about their work. For Geertz, this situation was defined by what he depicted as the systematic ambiguity of Arabic terms relevant to market transactions in the souk. In turn, the oblique tenor of discourse in the souk encouraged two market institutions as responses. First, clientelization, or enduring trade relationships between particular buyers and particular sellers. And second, a very delicate and culturally highly elaborated etiquette surrounding bargaining between client and patron. In his study of the bazaar economy in Safrou, Geertz was pressing the claim that his semiotic conception of culture was not merely useful window dressing for an economic analysis of this form of exchange. Rather, for Geertz, his cultural theory was critical to giving a full economic analysis of the information flows and allocation of resources within bazaar-based economies. In turn, this cultural theory of the bazaar economy was crucial for understanding the prospects for growth in the post-traditional, post-colonial societies of the Global South. Much more, I think, can be said about Geertz's attempt to fuse cultural theory and post-Walrasian economics, and I hope to say some of those things myself in future work. My aim this evening has been the more limited one of showing that Geertz pursued an integrated analytical project in which cultural theory and at least what I think of as a species of political economy were allies rather than opponents. Thank you.